Well, thank you very much, Robin, for that very gracious introduction. And I very much appreciate this invitation to participate in such a fine program. I also wanted to start out by thanking Dick Solomon, but also Robin, for their leadership in guiding and building a very important institution. I was talking with Bill Ingley at lunch. I remember when the Institute of Peace was established in 1984, and I've seen over the years how its board has included some great experience and talent. Yet I've seen time and again, as I'm sure many of you have, that to really make nonprofit institutions work, the role of the chairs and their operating presidents are absolutely fundamental to a successful institution. So in that sense, I want to thank both Robin and Dick. I think what has been striking to me over the years is that the stewards of the Institute of Peace wisely decided not to make it just another think tank. It's been a pathfinder, including in some less recognized but very important and practical areas, such as the cultural dimensions of negotiations. In my most recent experience, I found the Institute to be an excellent resource for the World Bank as we try to strengthen our role in the areas of post-conflict and fragile states. So I thought that might be a good topic to discuss with you today. New presidencies are invigorating because they offer a fresh start. The challenges they face, however, are a mix of the new but also stubborn recalcitrance of the past. As Mark Twain once observed, history may not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So let's take a step back to gain a fuller perspective on the challenge of securing development in 2009. In 1944, delegates from 45 nations gathered at Bretton Woods to consider the economic causes of the World War that was then raging. Their vision was not only to achieve military victory, but to how to secure the peace. Now that generation, like any other, had blind spots, but it perceived one very big idea: the nexus among economics, governance, and security. That gathering at Bretton Woods led to the creation of the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the original institution of what has become the World Bank Group. And as the delegates noted, quote, "Programs of reconstruction and development will speed economic progress everywhere, will aid political stability, and foster peace." Well, over 50 years later, a broken state, Afghanistan, became the weak link in the global security chain. The traumas of fragile states and the interconnections of globalization require our generation to recognize anew the nexus among economics, governance, and security. Most wars and conflicts are now within states, and fragile states account for most of them. Today, for the World Bank Group, the R in IBRD has a new meaning. It means restructuring Afghanistan, Cambodia, Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti, Iraq, Kosovo, Liberia, the Palestinian territories, the Solomon Islands, Southern Sudan, Timor-Leste, and other lands of conflict. In our last financial year, the Bank Group committed over $3 billion in development assistance to countries plagued by fragility and conflict. When states are breaking down or overcome by conflict, they create waves of danger. The first surge threatens the people that are living there. Fragile states have poverty rates that average 54%. They account for a third of the deaths in poor countries from HIV/AIDS, a third of those who lack access to clean water, a third of the children who do not complete primary school, and a half of all child deaths. But the next perilous wave caused by these states undermines their neighbors. As we've seen in South Asia and Africa, fragile states can create fragile regions, and fragile regions can become global threats. Fragile states are a witch's brew of ineffective government, poverty, and conflict. They suffer what Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart have called a sovereignty gap, a disjunction between the state's capacity to govern by law and its capacity to provide for the needs of people in practice. Fragility doesn't just mean low growth, but a failure in the normal growth processes, such that grindless, hopeless poverty becomes a persistent condition. Low and stagnant incomes, unemployment, and ineffective government can then spark violence. Paul Collier argues that the cycle of failed government, persistent poverty, and civil war creates a conflict trap for these countries, whereby violence in turn weakens security and institutional capacities, lowers incomes, destroys infrastructure, redirects resources from development. And Collier estimates that post-conflict countries are twice as likely as other developing countries to fall into conflict. Now, too often, the development community has treated states affected by fragility and conflict simply as harder cases of development. Yet these situations require looking beyond the analytics of both security studies and development to a different framework of building security, legitimacy, governance, and economy. This is not security as usual or development as usual, nor is this about what we've come to think as peace building or peacekeeping. This is about securing development, bringing security and development together first to smooth the transition from conflict to peace, and then to embed stability so that development can take hold over a decade or longer. Only by securing development can we put down roots that are deep enough to break the cycle of fragility and violence. But all of you know this will not be easy. I was struck by how an observation of former National Security Advisor Tony Lake parallels my experience. Quote, mention the deleterious political effects of a sound economic policy at a meeting of economic planners and watch their fingers drum impatiently on a table. Talk about the economic details at a conference of diplomats working on a political settlement and watch their eyes glaze over. Tell a politician about the importance of painful economic sacrifice now for the sake of economic health later and watch his or her eyes widen in alarm. To be frank, our appreciation of how best to secure development is still modest, and this will be one of the challenges for the incoming administration. So today, I want to suggest 10 considerations to help figure out what to do, or at least what questions to ask in fragile situations. First, in all things, one should keep in mind the need to build the legitimacy of the fragile state. In the terms of Clausewitz, building legitimacy is the Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity of the strategy. Now, of course, building security is fundamental, but it has to be connected to that larger strategic purpose. Legitimacy in fragile situations is not just achieved through elections or agreements that share power among factions. In some cases, premature elections may actually trigger a new cycle of violence. Legitimacy needs to be earned, in part by providing basic services, especially visible ones. Clean up the garbage. To achieve legitimacy, it's not only services that matter, but who performs the services. They should be undertaken by the government and the local people as soon as feasible. And this strategic consideration has to guide both the handoff from the humanitarian aid to the development aid, but also the design of the transition services. Even as donors pursue short-term objectives, they need to begin to strengthen and transfer responsibilities to ministries and local authorities. Second, the most important service for a fragile situation is the establishment of a relatively safe and secure environment. Given the linkages between the breakdowns of economy and stability, security and development need to go hand in hand, mutually reinforcing one another. In practice, this means more interaction on the ground between security and development staff so they can communicate respective interests, capabilities, and limitations. Soldiers may not wish to, or think they cannot, defend fixed points or lines, such as villages or power lines, pipelines or roads. But without some operational plan to minimize danger and disruptions, development may be impossible and a fragile state's legitimacy undermined. One lesson is that numbers matter. As many as 15,000 military personnel are authorized to keep the peace in Liberia for a population of 3.6 million, while the Democratic Republic of the Congo has roughly the same number of peacekeepers, but a population of more than 50 million in a country the size of Western Europe. If we're serious about breaking the downward spiral of violence and state breakdown, larger forces need to be in place longer. To build confidence, UN peacekeeping mandates and renewals should be authorized for much longer than 6 or 12 months. And in some cases, we may need mandates that are less restrictive, so UN operations can prevent the outbreak of violence. To build legitimacy and effectiveness, international partners also need to assist fragile states to build and pay for its own reliable police and armed forces. Properly organized and trained, local police and military are the key to securing public support, gaining intelligence, and sustaining security. Development experts, in turn, need to recognize the priority of using economic progress to boost security. When soldiers discuss the economics of security, their first priority is jobs, no matter how created. When a security gain can be leveraged, development projects may need to be suboptimal economically, good enough rather than first best. Third, the most fundamental prerequisite for sustainable development is building the rule of law and legal order, including respect for property rights. Yet, the international security and development communities have let the task of building justice and law enforcement systems fall between the cracks. It's not clear to me where the international capacity exists to help establish basic courts and tribunals to resolve disputes, train judges and advocates, and build prisons and police forces. The effort of the UNDPKO to launch an Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions is at least a start, and I think well worth the support of the new administration. A legal order is not only vital to public safety, it's also a safeguard against the serious risk of criminalization of the state. Corruption adds to fragility and lack of legitimacy. Abuse of state power destroys confidence and ultimately the state's legitimacy and its core purpose. Fourth, local and national ownership in state building is fundamental to achieving legitimacy, trust, and effectiveness. Community-driven development programs, which give control over decisions on investing modest resources to community groups and local governments, have proven very successful. At the national level, donors need to help governments develop the capacity to employ the national budget as a transparent tool for coherent planning and accountability. The starting point is to assist with the development of simple systems for financial management, payrolls, procurement. Otherwise, channeling resources through a national budget will be like pouring water on sand. If donors cannot work with a government to build national accountability systems that those donors can trust, how can we expect those publics to trust their own government? Fifth, macroeconomic stability is a prerequisite for effective recovery. Countries have to get the fundamentals right: fiscal, monetary, exchange rate policies, so that markets can expand, trade can resume, people can rely on a currency as a simple store of value, and investors can feel more secure about saving and building. But we have to recognize that fragile states are just that, fragile, especially in the face of sudden shocks. They need specialized real-time monitoring that can assess and respond with speed and flexible support. Reforms for economic stability need to be sequenced with political cycles to avoid triggering governance crises that will end up making economic reform impossible. The international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank Group, need tools to help more quickly, such as by clearing arrears, and then to fill the gaps promptly. Sixth, effective efforts to address fragility and conflict must be grounded in political economy, one that is capable of sustaining the peace. And this means taking into account the relationships between power and wealth in society. Conflict and instability can, after all, be a lucrative business for those in power who may exploit state resources or profit from the violence. If links develop between political power and illegal economic activity, they can deprive the legal economy of an opportunity to grow, the state of revenue, and both of them of legitimacy. And this may be especially dangerous in countries where there's natural resource wealth. Putting in place the economic incentives for stability and peace may not be enough if donors don't have a good understanding of who's going to win and who's going to lose from the peace settlements. Donors have to understand the history of countries and their people, who holds power, how power is brokered and used, and the relationship between these formal relationships and the formal institutions. Too many perfect economic plans have floundered on the rocks of political impossibility. Seventh, a focus on building state legitimacy, capacity, and performance cannot lead us to overlook the sustainable engine and recovery of growth, a healthy private sector. Enforceable property and contract rights and basic security that prevent predation on businesses offer the foundation. Transparent and simple rules lower the cost of doing business. They enable people to get started without fearing confiscations by the state. Given the risks and uncertainties of investing in a post-conflict environment, fragile states are going to need a combination of public and private support. Institutions such as the World Bank Group, with our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, can provide investment and advisory services, help assess the investment climate, develop basic financial services and microcredit, encourage better governance of the rule of law, and enable an environment for private sector activity. But we're going to have to develop more innovative models for leveraging public and private capital to build basic infrastructure such as power plants, ports, communications, transport, and energy systems. Eighth, states, international institutions, foundations, NGOs, and the private sector all have a role to play in these countries. But without greater coordination, and even, I might say, integration of activities, we're going to overwhelm the very governments that we seek to help. The average developing country hosts 260 visits from donors a year. Cambodia has 22 different donors in the health sectors with 109 separate projects. In 2006, across all developing countries, donors directed 70,000 aid transactions, and the average project size was $1.7 million. Now, this overload is a huge burden for any developing country's reform team. In a fragile state, it can become overwhelming. So we need joint assessments that reflect an inevitably dynamic process of rebalancing security, governance, development, always with an eye on building legitimacy. We need joint benchmarks to encourage convergence of strategies, and the countries need donors to create greater interoperability. Greater use of trust funds, where donors will pool resources together, could reduce the administrative burden on weak governments of having to deal with so many different donors. The United States, Japan, and some in Europe frankly have been reluctant to contribute to such trust funds. Furthermore, a more diverse group of partners may be able to broaden support for these countries. Brazil is leading the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. China's investors are a growing source of investment in developing countries, including in many fragile ones, just as its peacekeepers are serving in larger numbers in UN operations. And the development of a more effective and larger African Union peacekeeping force would be a great benefit, especially if they could become interoperable with developed country forces and logistical networks. Ninth, one has to consider the regional context. States in fragile situations can both be the cause of regional unrest and the object of manipulation by their neighbors. Successfully resolving conflict inside national borders may not be enough to build a lasting peace. We have to recognize the consequences of cross-border ties, whether tribal, ethnic, religious, or other transnational identity group, population movements, trade and smuggling routes, narcotics and criminal rings, or political links. These connections may underpin hostility or be the key to easing it. So resolving conflict requires a regional approach that provides positive incentives to neighbors and seeks to dissuade those that would despoil. We have some successful examples, such as the EU's support for reconstruction in the Balkans through the incentive of EU membership, the role of ECOWAS in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And in the early days, the bond process for Afghanistan appeared to encourage the recognition of common interests in lowering trade barriers, investing in energy and transit, controlling illegal narcotics, and pledging political non-interference, but that accomplishment is frayed seriously. 10th, these are not quick-fix countries. Support has to be there for the long haul. Money and humanitarian aid flood into the more fortunate countries at the beginning of a post-conflict settlement, often even beyond the state's capacity to absorb it. But when the CNN moment has passed, aid tapers off and attention shifts to another crisis. If we're going to be serious about the problems of countries in fragile situations or those coming out of conflict, funding mechanisms will have to ensure continuity and stability of resources over a decade or more. This will require changing financial parameters for fragile and post-conflict states. Take the World Bank, for example. We're constrained by an allocation formula that our donors established for the International Development Association, IDA, which is our largest source of highly concessionary financing. So given these 10 points, what guidance might I offer in practice? First, Afghanistan. The counterinsurgency model of clear, hold, and build can only succeed if security is combined with effective governance and development. Yet to the actors on the ground, the very meaning of security may differ. As one Canadian development official told me in Afghanistan, to a soldier in body armor and a female NGO worker living in a village, security can mean very different things. Numbers do matter. NATO does need more troops in Afghanistan, but their mission can't be just to kill the enemy, because the regional realities will mean that there are always more to fight. So NATO's security plan needs a tighter link to development outcomes that will boost local legitimacy, ownership, and eventually security by Afghans for Afghans. Foreign military actions that kill innocent Afghans trade tactical wins for strategic losses. To build legitimacy, we have to achieve concrete results. For example, the delivery of basic services operated by national authorities working with local communities. The National Solidarity Program, which the Afghan government launched with the support of the World Bank, offers a very attractive foundation on which to build. The National Solidarity Program has already reached 17 million Afghans in 22,000 communities in all 34 provinces. It uses small block grants to support community projects that are selected by village-based elected community development councils to build local infrastructure such as roads, irrigation works, water supply, microelectricity, and schools. And the NSP's projects have an economic rate of return close to 20%. There's now an opportunity to expand the NSP and build on its model of local self-governance. Democratically elected development councils lead to more involvement and a greater representation of the population at community level. By interconnecting and consolidating some local projects, a renewed National Solidarity Program could foster integration within Afghanistan while expanding the network of public involvement. Afghanistan's international supporters will also have to keep in mind the strategic objective of helping it to build a legitimate, self-sustaining state. At present, 2/3 of aid to Afghanistan flows outside the government. Now, this is going to frustrate those trying to build the institutions of a legitimate Afghan government. With strong, effective ministerial leadership, there have been great advances in health, education, telecommunication services, and now the government needs the help of its partners to focus on the missed opportunities, lagging sectors such as agriculture, private sector development, infrastructure, and energy. And at the same time, it needs to vigorously attack pervasive corruption. Now, of course, international partners have bypassed the government because of their lack of confidence in the capacity, transparency, and commitment to achieve results. So increased reliance on a national budget would have to be combined with stronger public financial management, efforts against corruption, investment in human capacity, and a common understanding on the results to be achieved. With 62 different partners in Afghanistan, such mutual accountability would require more and better donor coordination, pooling of funds to support measurable national objectives. And in return, the government would have to strengthen the leadership and effectiveness of key ministries. These steps would give the Afghans some strategic space to build for the longer term. The government will need time to build a larger army. It needs to overhaul its police force. It needs to help build legal and judicial systems that can support the development of private enterprise. Historically, Afghanistan has been a weak state whose internal politics have been manipulated by stronger neighbors. Now, that picture is unlikely to change completely, but a complementary regional diplomatic effort, such as that through the earlier bond process, can draw out neighbors' shared interest in fostering economic integration with an Afghanistan that threatens no other state's security. As part of this strategy, security and development has to be integrated to substitute legitimate agriculture and business for the opium economy. As we've seen in Colombia and elsewhere, narco regimes will gradually take over legitimate governments. They cannot coexist. In Afghanistan, the opium business both finances the war within the fragile state and corrupts its very legitimacy. The income from drugs is concentrated near the top of the pyramid. Roughly 80% of their export value goes to less than 15,000 traffickers and traders, while the remaining 20% is spread over 350,000 farming families. Now, this suggests to me needs for both targeting law enforcement and rural development. Now take Haiti, where securing development is no less vital. 200 miles from our shores, Haiti's stability matters. Yet the record is pretty disappointing. After 2 U.S. armed interventions in the last 20 years, 5 peacekeeping missions, billions of dollars, Haiti nevertheless remains a country with some of the worst human development indicators in the world. Haiti was the site of too many feel-good projects draped in national flags. Haiti's partners paid insufficient attention to governance, anti-corruption, and building the legitimacy of the government. Too many sterile debates about which comes first, security or development. In compounding that record, a geography that has put Haiti in the eye of 4 successive natural disasters, destroying some 15% of its GDP, further aggravating a year of catastrophe that was already hit by food and fuel crisis. Training of police, judges, prison reform, the creation of an enabling environment for private sector investment to build on the investment potential of the Haitian diaspora, and the over $1 billion in remittances that flow to Haiti each year. Recapitalization of a textile industry to enable it to take advantage of the U.S. HOPE 2 Act, and a much closer integration between peacekeepers and development teams in terms of building roads, upgrading slums, and in the crucial areas of port and custom reforms to help capture the over $200 million in customs and tax revenues that go uncollected every year. This doesn't mean turning swords into plowshares. It does mean ensuring that swords and plowshares work together to harvest development, helping to build the legitimacy of the state and undermining the spoilers. President Preval has required senior government officials managing public resources to disclose their financial asset as a check on public corruption and conflict. The Haitian government now needs to take a further step by forging a national consensus to put aside the partisan conflict in the parliament and in the streets to support 3 or 4 key development objectives that the country and its international partners can rally around over the next few years. To catalyze this Haitian political process, donors will need to be able to unite and act much more effectively. To do so, donors are going to have to reduce the administrative burden that they impose on a very weak Haitian state. The United States should agree to pool its resources with others through trust funds so that Haiti and its supporters can concentrate effort on trying to build government effectiveness while achieving baseline development goals. It certainly would help if donors, which are also the World Bank shareholders, would permit us to help more by authorizing exceptional funding support. And then with the national political consensus and the cohesion of donors and some additional help from the World Bank, backed by the sufficient aid, Haiti could try to target the development level of Central America over the next decade. Now, Liberia offers a stark contrast to Haiti. It's a poster child for post-conflict development. But Liberia, like Haiti, underscores the need for new approaches. Front-loading resources to provide tangible benefits to an embattled population is absolutely key. As President Johnson Sirleaf told me, $1 today is worth much more to us than $50 in 3 years. But the development business as usual too often calls for a straitjacket of track records, arrears clearance that takes too long, or mathematical formula for resource allocations that defy political realities and opportunities on the ground. Now, there are ways to overcome these restrictions without throwing away good money, and the Liberia experience gives some examples on how they could work. Take just two. To fill an early sovereignty gap before democratic elections in 2007, the transitional government and donors in Liberia agreed to co-signing authority by expatriate agents on vouchers and checks and other government expenditure instruments to combat corruption and conflict over spoils. Another example was deployed to produce an immediate peace dividend. An innovative, labor-intensive program was spearheaded by UN peacekeeping forces and partially financed by the World Bank to help rehabilitate rural roads, thereby increasing access to remote and insecure provinces while creating jobs on the back of a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. Both short-term measures, both designed to help build a gap from conflict stability, and neither were the routine approaches of our development of security playbooks. 25 years ago, Liberia was a middle-income country and the richest in West Africa. It exported rubber and timber and rice. Liberia can prosper again on the same sources of income, its rich natural resources, as well as its geographical position. But to build a legitimate state and to heal a traumatized society, growth will have to be broadly distributed, backed by a social contract that includes basic health, education, and water services to all. The massive unmilled force has kept troublemakers at bay while the National Army and Police are being rebuilt. But with unemployment rates for young people at about 60%, insecurity still shadows Liberia. Liberia needs a combination of basic infrastructure, basic services delivered by communities, and new investment that creates jobs, including for small enterprises. The government has done much to improve the investment climate, but Liberia needs to get the Port of Monrovia working again. The World Bank, including IFC, our private sector arm, could also innovate through public-private partnerships to assist with both basic utilities and building a network to assist small-scale farmers with access to inputs, finance, marketing channels, and appropriate technology. But here's the problem. Attention to Liberia is already waning. Its heroic president is being feted, but what she really needs is more help. So the new administration could give Liberia high priority with a strategy of building regional integration in Africa. For Liberia, Afghanistan, and Haiti to succeed at the vital points of security, governance, and development, all three will need more resources, more donor coordination through trust funds, more high-visibility results. If we're going to be serious about helping these countries, donors have to step up to the challenge, but so must their national leadership. In Liberia, I traveled with President Johnson Sirleaf to one of the town halls that she holds throughout the country to explain the government's goals, introduce ministers, take questions, and in effect forge a sense of national endeavor. So whether it's building a consensus in Liberia, taking on corruption in Haiti, or facing the risks of opium production in Afghanistan, strong and decisive national leadership matters. Even the best-laid development plan will flounder on the back of national indifference. Secure development requires national ownership. Outsiders can help, but they can't substitute for local ownership and responsibility. A final word. Development is a tough business in the very best of circumstances. In fragile states, it's not only that much harder, but it presents a different type of challenge from which our traditional toolkit has not been well equipped. Unfortunately, our primary institutional tools, both national and multilateral, talk about innovation while stifling it with bureaucratic governance. Risk is only accepted if ventures succeed. Security development in fragile states will have the qualities of a venture fund. Performance is going to vary. We shouldn't retreat from risk, but learn how to mitigate and manage risk to the full extent possible in the clear knowledge that some projects will fail, but that without innovative and flexible approaches, none will succeed. So the stakes are very high. Thank you.
I want to, when I began, I said Bob is a serious man. This was a serious and I think very, very thoughtful speech. Thank you, Bob. Every speaker gets a party favor. You get a baton, as Wendy Sherman pointed out. It's not a magic wand, but it's a symbol of the process we're going through here of shifting to a new administration, and I think you did an absolutely brilliant job outlining some of the challenges that we all face. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.